The mountains hold secrets that the world has long forgotten, but tonight, one of those secrets walked right up to a porch light. Imagine sitting by your fire, only to find the Queen of the Wild staring through your glass, her heart in her jaws. This is the legend of the Mother's Plea, a journey of ancient trust, a silver-bladed rescue, and a bond that changed two souls forever. Chapter 1: The Shadow on the Threshold. The mountains were not merely heaps of rock and snow, they were ancient, brooding giants that guarded the secrets of the high peaks with a jealous ferocity. In the dead of winter, the wind did not just blow, it howled like a banshee, weaving through the jagged crags and whispering warnings to any living soul brave enough to listen. It was a place where the boundary between the civilized world and the untamed wild was as thin as a silver thread, easily snapped by the weight of a single, desperate moment. Down in the valley, nestled against the hem of the forest, stood a solitary timber-framed house. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. Sarah sat by the hearth, the fire crackling and spitting sparks like a grumpy phoenix. To any passerby, it was a picture of perfect domestic peace, but Sarah felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. It was the sort of feeling one gets when they are being watched by something that doesn't use eyes to see. The silence was abruptly shattered by a heavy, resonant thud against the front door. It wasn't the polite rap of a traveler or the frantic scratching of a stray dog. It was a weighted, deliberate impact that made the iron hinges groan in protest. Sarah froze, her heart thumping against her ribs like a snitch trying to escape its crate. In this wilderness, visitors after dark usually brought news that no one wanted to hear. The thud came again, more insistent this time, followed by a long, low scrape that sounded unnervingly like a claw dragging across parchment. It was the sound of something immense and ancient, something that didn't belong on a welcome mat. Slowly, as if moving through a dream, Sarah stood up. Her legs felt heavy, but a strange, magnetic pull drew her toward the entryway. Peering through the frosted glass pane, her breath hitched, and for a moment, she forgot how to breathe entirely. There, bathed in the amber glow of the porch light, stood a creature of legend. A mountain lion, her tawny fur dusted with diamonds of ice, was standing on the doorstep. She was a ghost of the high ridges, a creature of shadow and silver, looking directly into Sarah's soul. The cougar didn't hiss, nor did she crouch in the lethal stance of a hunter. She stood with a tragic sort of dignity, her powerful shoulders rising and falling with the effort of her breath. Her eyes were wide, golden orbs that seemed to hold a centuries-old wisdom. Sarah found herself staring into them, and what she saw was not the hunger of a predator, but the frantic, piercing clarity of a mother who had run out of time. There was an eerie, magical stillness to the encounter, a suspension of the natural laws that usually kept such beasts in the darkness. Sarah felt a peculiar connection, a jolt of empathy that bypassed her brain and went straight to her heart. It was as if a silent spell had been cast, linking the woman in the armchair to the Queen of the Mountains. She realized then that the knock had been no accident of the wind. The cougar had sought out this light, this warmth, and this specific door. As the blizzard began to shriek around the corners of the cabin, the great cat stepped closer to the glass, her breath fogging the pane in a rhythmic, desperate pulse. The invitation had been issued, and the world held its breath. Chapter 2: The Burden of the Queen. As Sarah's vision adjusted to the flickering shadows, she realized this was no ordinary visit from a forest phantom. This was a mother, and she was carrying a burden that felt heavier than the mountain itself. With a grace that was almost liquid, the cougar lowered her head. She moved with a maternal tenderness that seemed to soften the very air around her, a stark contrast to the formidable claws tucked into her paws. In her massive jaws, she held a small, limp bundle of fur, her cub. The little creature was a miniature reflection of its mother, but its spirit seemed to be flickering like a dying candle. It hung motionless, its head lolling to the side as the mother placed it carefully upon the mat. It was a sight of such profound, raw vulnerability that it felt like a stab of cold iron to the chest. The cub was shivering with a violence that shook its entire frame, its tiny chest heaving in shallow, whistling gasps. Its fur was matted and wet, smelling of frozen river water and the metallic tang of the winter air. It was clear that the cub was in the icy grip of a deep, magical-like slumber from which it might never wake without help. The mother mountain lion didn't growl, nor did she display the fierce pride of her station. Instead, she let out a low, mournful trill, a sound so full of heartache that it seemed to vibrate through the wooden door and settle in Sarah's marrow. It was a cry of absolute, unfiltered desperation, the kind of sound a parent makes when they have reached the very edge of the world. She had abandoned the safety of her high-altitude fortresses and the anonymity of the pines to bring her dying child to the only place left that promised fire. She had risked the wrath of humans, those unpredictable and dangerous giants, because her love outweighed her fear. To the cougar, the house was no longer a threat, it was a sanctuary of last resort. The mother cat looked up from her cub, her golden eyes searching Sarah's face for a glimmer of mercy. She nudged the small, frozen bundle toward the crack of the door, a gesture so human it was startling. It was a surrender of her most precious treasure, a plea for a miracle that only a creature of the hearth could provide. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, as if the forest were waiting for an answer. The mother stood there, her tawny coat glowing against the white snow like a forgotten gold coin. She was a sovereign of the wild reduced to a supplicant, her only hope resting on the other side of a piece of glass. Sarah watched as the mother cougar licked the cub's ear, a final, desperate attempt to spark life back into its body. It was a gesture of such universal love that the barrier between species seemed to melt away. The mountain lion had brought her heart to the door, and now she waited for the world to decide if it would beat again. Chapter 3: The Pact of the Hearth. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline that felt remarkably like a dose of pepper potion, her mind spinning with the sheer impossibility of the moment. Every scrap of common sense screamed at her to stay away, to lock the door and wait for the dawn. A mountain lion in distress is a volatile force of nature, a whirlwind of claws and teeth driven by a desperate maternal instinct. One wrong movement could turn this silent plea into a violent tragedy. If the mother thought her cub was being harmed, no bolt or bar would keep her out. Yet, Sarah couldn't pull her gaze away from the tiny, shivering form on the mat. The cub's life was leaking away, and every second Sarah spent in hesitation was a second stolen from its future. The mountain lion tapped the glass again, her heavy paw moving with a deliberate, haunting rhythm. Sarah saw the exhaustion in the cat's eyes, a weariness that went deeper than bone. This was an ancient pact being offered, a bridge built of necessity across the divide of the wild and the civilized. Sarah reached for the brass handle, her fingers trembling as if they were made of glass. She knew that opening this door was a form of madness that would be whispered about in the village for generations. She was inviting a 100-pound predator into her home. But as she looked at the cub's closed eyes, she knew that silence was the same as a sentence of death. She took a deep breath, the air smelling of ozone and wood smoke, and whispered a word of courage to herself. She thought of the old stories where humans and animals spoke a common tongue, a language of the heart that required no words. She felt a heavy, sacred duty to honor the trust that had been laid at her feet. Slowly, she turned the lock, the metallic click echoing like a crack of thunder in the small room. Her heart was drum-beating against her ribs. She watched the mother cougar's ears, looking for the slightest twitch of aggression. But the cat remained as still as a stone gargoyle, her eyes fixed on Sarah with a piercing, expectant intensity. The door creaked open, admitting a gust of freezing mountain air that sent the curtains dancing like ghosts. Sarah's skin erupted in goosebumps, and the scent of the wild rushed in, pine needles, wet fur, and the cold, clean smell of the peaks. The mother cougar shifted her weight, but she did not lunge. She waited for the invitation to be completed. In that moment of suspended time, Sarah made her choice. She wasn't just opening a door, she was participating in a miracle. She pulled the door wide and stepped back into the shadows, offering the sanctuary of the flame. The boundary was gone. And for the first time in her life, Sarah was standing face to face with the true, untamed magic of the world. Chapter 4: The Guest of the Fire. The mother cougar lingered on the porch for a heartbeat, her eye scanning the room with the sharp, calculating gaze of an experienced scout. She looked at the flickering shadows on the walls and the strange, wooden objects that filled the space. It was a moment of profound evaluation, a mother deciding if this strange, glowing cave was truly safe for her child. Time seemed to stretch thin as the woman and the wild cat stood locked in a silent stare across the threshold. Sarah remained perfectly still, her hands open to show she held no wand or weapon. She tried to radiate a sense of calm, a silent promise that the peace of the house would be the cub's shield. With a cautious, liquid elegance, the mother cougar lowered her head and took up her cub once more. She stepped over the threshold, her heavy paws making no sound on the floorboards, moving like a shadow through a dream. It was a sight that defied all logic, a queen of the peaks walking through a human parlor as if she had been invited to tea. She ignored the chairs and the tables, heading straight for the source of the golden light. She laid her cub down on the thick rug directly in front of the fireplace, the heat from the embers immediately washing over its wet fur. She stood over her child for a moment, her silhouette cast large and imposing against the far wall. Then, she turned her head to look at Sarah. It was a look that transcended speech, a silent agreement between two souls. The pact was signed, the cougar would trust, and the human would heal. The great cat sat back on her haunches, her tail twitching with a nervous energy, a silent guardian waiting for the miracle to begin. Sarah moved with the slow, deliberate care of a librarian handling a rare manuscript. She gathered a pile of soft, woolen blankets and approached the hearth, keeping her head low and her movements predictable. She reached out and draped a warm cloth over the cub's shivering body. The mother's eyes narrowed, but she made no move to interfere. As the heat began to seep into the cub's bones, the violent shaking began to subside. Sarah brought a bowl of warm water and a dropper, carefully moistening the cub's parched mouth. Every time she moved, she felt the weight of the mother's gaze upon her, a pressure that felt like the mountain itself was watching her work. The room was filled with the rhythmic crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of two mothers who had found a common purpose. In the orange light of the hearth, the living room had become a sacred chamber, a place where the wild and the domestic had finally found a common ground. They sat together in the silence, waiting for the dawn to bring a sign of life. Chapter 5: The Morning Miracle. The hours passed in a long, moonlit blur of warmth and watchful waiting. Sarah sat on the floor a few feet away, her eyes never leaving the small bundle of fur. She could see the mother cougar's reflection in the dark window, a constant, golden-eyed reminder of the power that shared her space. Yet, the fear had vanished, replaced by a deep, quiet awe. Slowly, the magic of the hearth began to work its wonders. The cub shivering finally ceased, replaced by a deep, restorative sleep. Its breathing became slow and steady, no longer a series of frantic gasps but a rhythmic pulse of returning strength. The warmth of the fire had chased the icy specter of the mountain from its tiny limbs. In the deepest part of the night, the cub's eyes flickered open, bright, curious orbs the color of a clear summer sky. It looked around the strange room, its ears twitching at the sound of the popping logs, before its gaze found its mother. The cub let out a soft, tiny mew, a sound of such pure life that Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. The mother cougar responded with a low, vibrating purr that seemed to make the very floorboards hum with joy. She stood up and approached her child, licking its head with a rough tongue to clean away the last of the mountain's frost. The cub tried to stand, its legs wobbling like those of a newborn foal, but the light of life was back in its eyes. As the first, pale rays of dawn began to touch the snowy peaks outside, the mother cougar knew it was time to leave. The sanctuary had done its work, and the wild was calling them back to the heights. She stood tall, her tawny coat glowing in the morning light, looking every bit the sovereign she was. She gave her cub a firm, encouraging nudge toward the door. The mother cat looked at Sarah one last time. It was a deep, piercing look that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets. There was no bow, no word, but there was a profound sense of recognition, a mutual understanding that they had shared a moment that had rewritten the laws of the world. For one night, they had been sisters under the skin. With a fluid, graceful movement, the mother took up her cub by the scruff of its neck. She walked toward the open door, her silhouette framed by the rising sun. She stepped out into the crisp, morning air, paused for a final look at the warmth she was leaving behind, and then vanished into the rising mist of the valley. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching the spot where they had disappeared into the trees. The door remained open, but the mountain would never feel quite so cold again. A mother's love had bridged the impossible, and a human's mercy had answered the call. The silence of the peaks returned, but in Sarah's heart, the roar of that miracle would never fade. Miracles like these only happen when we choose mercy over fear. If this story of the mother cougar moved you, join our growing community of protectors by hitting that subscribe button. We bring you a new cinematic legend every single day. Don't let the fire go out, become part of the story.